Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to provide you with more updates on what's going on with regards to Lukoil's overseas assets. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that Lukoil is the second largest oil producer in Russia. It's the largest private company in Russia, and it was sanctioned directly by the USA on the 23rd of October. And as a direct result of those sanctions, Lukoil is now struggling to be able to keep its overseas operations running because nobody wants to deal with a sanctioned entity, because then you run the risk of being sanctioned yourself. And no financial institutions in the West are now prepared to let any payments come or go from Lukoil. So this is causing major problems. And the issue that a lot of countries are facing is that Lukoil owns some really important assets. And Bulgaria has now taken the first step by passing a law in Parliament approving the seizure and sale of Lukoil's Burgas refinery. And the reason why they've done this is because it's the only refinery in Bulgaria. It's got a capacity of around 190,000 barrels per day. So it's taking in crude oil and then converting that crude oil into things like gasoline and diesel, which are obviously needed by the people and the businesses in Bulgaria. So Bulgaria can't really keep operating without this refinery running. So rather than waiting for Lukoil to try and sort something out, which quite frankly is going to be impossible anyway, because now that Lukoil has been hit with direct sanctions, it can't sell anything. Nobody can actually give any money to Lukoil because you'd be going against the sanctions that are now in place. So Lukoil is trying to manage this as if it's some sort of big M&A facility where they're going to come in and deal with people and try to negotiate deals in each country. But realistically, that's not going to happen because, as I said in a previous video, M&A transactions of this nature and size in the oil and gas industry usually take months, sometimes even years to conclude, because you have to get all sorts of approvals, you have to do due diligence, you have to go in and have a look at what's going on. But Bulgaria doesn't have that time because it needs to keep that refinery running, keep it operating, to make sure that all of the fuel stations in Bulgaria don't run dry. So rather than waiting for Lukoil to do something about it, they've seized the initiative, they've passed this law, and so Bulgaria will be seizing those assets. So a government-appointed manager is going to take control of the business on the 21st of November because the sanctions that were put into place allowed Lukoil until the 21st of November to basically conclude all of its business to try to get rid of this. But clearly, that's only a couple of weeks away. So realistically, they're not going to be able to do that. So Bulgaria have now thought, well, why wait? We might as well just sort this out now. And this is the first major takeover of a stake of a Russian refinery in Europe. So this is the first time it's happening to Russia. Russia has nationalized lots of different businesses over the past 3 years that it's seen to be important for its continuation, and a lot of the overseas owners didn't get anything in return. Those assets were just taken away from them. But Russia is really unhappy about this situation. I'll come on later in the video to talk about what their official response has been, but they seem to be a bit surprised and feel like everybody is being unfair towards them. But we'll go on to talk about that in a moment. But that's what's happening in Bulgaria. But I wanted to run through the latest updates as to what's happening in the other countries, because Lukoil has lots of different facilities all around the world. It's one of the main global players coming out of Russia because it made lots of acquisitions. So in the United States, there are around 200 Lukoil branded gas stations. Predominantly, these are clustered in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York, as it was through an old acquisition that Lukoil made back in 2000. Now, the difference with that business is that it's not being run predominantly by Lukoil. This is actually a franchise operation. So we talked about franchises recently, but basically a franchise is where if you want to set up a gas station, rather than just setting up and calling it Joe Bloggs Gas, which people might think, I don't want to buy Joe Bloggs Gas, I don't know who Joe Bloggs is. You can do it under a brand. So in this circumstance, it was Lukoil. So you take on a gas station and then you sign a franchise agreement with the head office of Lukoil, and then you will be able to then have the Lukoil sign on your gas station, and you'll get all of your fuel and everything else provided to you by Lukoil, and you have to pay a franchise fee for that. So they're actually local businesses being run by local people. Although they have the Lukoil brand on them, they're not actually being run by Lukoil operatives. There's not a lot of Russian people turning up in New Jersey to start serving gas to people. So it's a slightly different business model. Obviously, there is a link to Lukoil through the franchise agreement, and I would imagine that franchise agreement will basically be cancelled at some point in the near future. And some other company will probably take over the branding and the franchise arrangement with all of the local franchisees. So whilst Lukoil does remain as a brand in some areas of the USA, it's not really operating as a Russian business. And certainly the oil, the fuel that's being delivered to those service stations isn't coming from Russia. It's coming from US refiners predominantly. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. I'm sure we'll see an announcement shortly as to what the USA is doing about the Lukoil brand, because it will want it taken off all of those gas stations. Now, in Finland, there is a slightly different situation because Lukoil does own and operate lots of different fuel stations, around 430, which is about 20% of Finland's total sites. Now, this business has actually been in decline over the past few years. It's seen its revenue coming down from, in 2022, 2.4 billion euros, which is over $2.5 billion. It's come down to 1.6. So that's partly as a result of the sanctions, partly as a result of the backlash against Russia. So it's been in decline anyway. But the problem that Finland has is that it needs these 430 sites to keep operating. So at the moment, they're running short of fuel because Lukoil is struggling to be able to provide them. I would imagine that if this situation continues, Finland are going to have to follow a very similar path to Bulgaria. They'll need to step in, take control of these businesses, and then provide them with a new form of supply for all of their fuel, because clearly they can't allow any Russian oil to come in, and also they don't want a Russian business that is sanctioned to keep operating in Finland because it can't make and receive payments. It's a real problem for all of those different operators. In Moldova, Lukoil operates fuel stations and actually provides the country's only airport refuel hub. So all of the planes that are going in and out of Moldova are reliant on Lukoil's operations. And as a result of that, Lukoil has actually asked for a temporary waiver to avoid an aviation crisis because it can't refuel any of its planes without dealing with Lukoil. Now, interestingly, the Moldovan government has rejected Lukoil's sale proposal. They're not going to allow Lukoil to sell this business. It wants direct control. So I think we're only a few days away from Moldova following Bulgaria into the same course of action of seizing control, passing some sort of law and saying, listen, we haven't got time to mess around. We need to keep our airports open. It's really important to our economy. So we're going to take over that and then sort out some other form of supply. In Turkey, there are around 600 gas stations owned directly by Lukoil, and this was through an acquisition back in 2008. So Lukoil is intending to sell this network. That's what it's announced. However, in line with all the other ones that we've just discussed, I don't think Turkey are going to hang around trying to wait for a sale process. And also, when you think about that sale process, how are Lukoil actually going to affect the deal? Because they are a sanctioned entity. Nobody can deal with sanctioned entities. So even if BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, whoever comes along and says, we'll buy those 600 stations, firstly, they shouldn't be dealing with Lukoil anyway. And then secondly, they can't make a payment to them because all the assets would be frozen. So it'd have to go into a frozen account and then possibly wait until sanctions are released at some point in the future. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think Turkey will do exactly the same as Bulgaria. They will just seize those assets and give them over to one of the other operators. Maybe some money will change hands. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of the payments. Now, in Romania, there's actually 320 gas stations, and the government is expecting Lukoil to withdraw. There hasn't been any announcement yet, but there's a lot of pressure now on the regional hub. It looks like it potentially could collapse, and so Romania could face a fuel crisis. So it seems very likely to me that Romania are going to have to step in and take over those assets in the same way as Bulgaria has. And in terms of the other countries that are involved, we touched on this in a previous video, so I won't go through it in any detail. But we've got Iraq, who recently cancelled deliveries from 3 different Lukoil crude cargoes, so they've already cut back on dealing with them. In Kazakhstan, there's lots of different joint ventures, and the government are reviewing what they should do with that. Uzbekistan, officials say the buyout is not on the table anymore, and consultations are currently underway with partners and US authorities as to what's going to happen with their assets. So, looks like it's going to be a state takeover to me. In the Netherlands, the government is now under severe pressure over Lukoil's 45% holding in the Zeeland refinery. I think it's likely that that will probably be nationalised. In Serbia and North Macedonia, Lukoil owns gas stations which are still operating but are coming under intense scrutiny because of the sanctions. And in Azerbaijan, the operations are still continuing under a licence that's been issued by the UK, allowing them to continue to try to have a sort of controlled workout to get Lukoil out of the country. Now, in terms of what Russia's reaction to this has been, well, it's interesting that the Kremlin has called the sanctions and seizures illegal interference in trade. And we've got a quote from the foreign minister, and he said, "We believe that all legitimate interests of a major international company, including a Russian one like Lukoil, must be respected." Now, that's quite interesting because when you look at what's happened to lots of international companies that were operating in Russia over the last 3 years, they've had a lot of their assets completely seized and stolen, essentially. So Russia doesn't seem to be acknowledging what's been happening at home, but it's saying that nobody should be allowed to deal with Russian businesses in this way because it's not fair. And they've accused the West of stealing private property. And this potentially means that there could be some countermeasures coming against Western firms that are still operating in Russia. So overall, Russia is very unhappy. They don't think it's fair, but unfortunately for Russia, Lukoil is not going to see any value for any of its overseas assets. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been following what's been happening since those direct sanctions were applied against Rosneft and Lukoil. And what we are seeing now is that Lukoil's overseas operations are starting to implode. Now, when we talk about Rosneft is the biggest oil company in Russia, and it's really struggling because its main operations have been to supply India and China with lots of oil over the past 3.5 years. And as I talked about in previous videos, both China and India are now pulling back from those purchases, as are Turkey, which is the third largest buyer of Russian oil. So Rosneft is really suffering because it's seeing a huge reduction in the volume of oil that it's shipping. There is now a record amount of Russian oil sitting on the water. So they filled lots of tankers. They've left ports in Russia, but they're not able to actually dock anywhere because India and China don't want them. They're turning them away. So at some point, all of those tankers will be full, and then Russia will have to start cutting back on its production because, as we've talked about before, it doesn't have anywhere to store that oil. It can't just put it somewhere underground and then wait for the orders to come back. What it will have to do is cut back on the amount of oil it's taking out of the ground. And that could have some serious operational problems going forward because, as we've said, a lot of these operations are in very cold climates where there's a lot of ice. It's really incredibly difficult to keep those operations going smoothly, especially if you start trying to put the brakes on. So Rosneft is in a world of pain already. But what we talked about in today's video is that Lukoil, which was basically the market leader in Russia for overseas operations, it's gone around buying up lots of different businesses upstream and downstream all across Europe and the world. It's now suffering because those direct sanctions mean that nobody can deal with Lukoil. So you can't make payments to Lukoil, you can't receive payments from Lukoil unless you want to be sanctioned yourself. And obviously, nobody wants that to happen. So what we've seen is that overnight, Lukoil's overseas operations have stopped. And that's a major problem for a lot of the countries that Lukoil's operating in because these are key assets. And Bulgaria, which is the first country to take direct action, has now passed a law enabling it to seize all of the assets. And the reason that it's done that is because the only refinery in Bulgaria is operated by Lukoil, and without that refinery, the whole country is going to come to a grinding halt. It will run out of fuel. Nobody will be able to fill up their cars, delivery vans, any trucks. So businesses and individuals basically won't be able to get around anywhere. So Bulgaria doesn't want that to happen. It doesn't want to go into recession just because Lukoil has been sanctioned and it's stopped receiving all of its fuel. So it's passed a law to take over all of Lukoil's assets, and Lukoil won't receive any compensation for that. So that's a bad news from Lukoil's point of view. But what's likely to happen is that all of the other countries that we talked about in today's video are going to follow suit, because nobody wants to hang around and let Lukoil handle this for them, because firstly, Lukoil has been sanctioned, so it doesn't have the capacity to enter into agreements with companies and countries. It won't allow any payments backwards and forwards. So Lukoil basically is dead in the water in terms of its international M&A business. So all of these economies need to take over these assets to make sure that they don't get disrupted by the fact that Lukoil can no longer trade. So this is obviously really bad news for Lukoil. It's spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the last 30 years expanding its operations. It's now lost the vast majority of those operations, so it doesn't have the revenue or the cash flow or the currency coming in anymore. So that's really bad news from Lukoil's point of view. It means it will have much lower revenue, potentially could go into loss-making situation because it has a very high cost base back in Russia. So it's gone from being one of the biggest companies in Russia to potentially being loss-making. That's bad news for Lukoil, but it's also really bad news for the Russian economy, because obviously Lukoil won't be paying lots of tax, therefore it won't contribute to the Russian economy, and so GDP will contract further. So all of that's bad news. But equally, what we are seeing here is that Russia is getting very upset. It's saying this isn't fair. People are taking our assets off us. That shouldn't be allowed in international trade. It's nothing to do with Lukoil that Russia's invaded Ukraine. But unfortunately, the reality of the situation is that firstly, Russia has been doing this for the past 3.5 years. It's been seizing control of lots of Western assets and disregarding international trade laws, just basically taking those assets. And then secondly, what's happening in Ukraine does affect Lukoil because it's a Russian business, and Russia as a whole is causing problems, and that's why the sanctions have been applied against Lukoil, not because Lukoil has done something specifically to attract sanctions. It's because the West wants the war in Ukraine to stop, and the best way of doing that, or the last resort way that is everybody's facing now, is to apply such severe financial sanctions that it hurts the Russian economy to the point where it has to stop the war because it can't keep funding it. So it's intrinsically linked. You can't separate Lukoil from what's happening in Ukraine. It's all tied together. And so I don't think Russia's claims that this is unfair are actually justified. This is basically the reality of what's happening as a result of the war in Ukraine and the sanctions. And it's really bad news for Lukoil and the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thanks to everyone who's supporting me. If you've signed up as a Patreon or a YouTube member, thank you so much, really appreciate that. And if you've bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a Buy Me a Coffee member, thanks for that support, means a lot, and here's something to put a smile on your face.